You're getting married tomorrow, but instead of picking your partner, your parents sold you off at age 12 to make a business deal work. Your wedding night becomes a public show where guests actually watch you get into bed. And if you live through the scary childbirth that's almost sure to happen next, you've got maybe a 50-50 chance your husband won't beat you to death legally. Welcome to medieval marriage, where, till death do us part, was less about romance and more about reality. Think your dating life is hard? Try living when your father could sell you to whoever paid the most before you could even walk. Your wedding night came with an audience. Getting pregnant was like playing a deadly game. And divorce was about as possible as flying to the moon. By the time we're done here, you'll be thanking every dating app. Compared to what our ancestors went through for marriage, even your worst breakup looks like a happy ending. Let's dive into the medieval marriage nightmare that makes modern dating look like paradise. Let's start with Margaret Beaufort, who lived at the very end of the medieval period and would become the mother of the Tudor dynasty. At age 6, her guardians married her off to John de la Pole in what was basically a real estate deal. Margaret never even understood this marriage, she was literally too young to know what was happening to her. But the adults around her knew exactly what they were doing, getting control of her huge inheritance. 3 years later, when politics changed, they cancelled that marriage like it never happened and sold her again. This time to Edmund Tudor, who was 24 years old. Margaret was 12. Here's where it gets worse. While medieval law technically allowed marriage at these ages, there was an unspoken rule that you waited until the girl was at least 14 before making the marriage official. Edmund Tudor decided he couldn't wait. Within months of their wedding, 12-year-old Margaret was pregnant. But Margaret's story wasn't unique. Take Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France. In 1396, she was married off to King Richard II of England. Isabella was 6 years and 5 days old. Her dowry, the goods she brought to marriage, literally included her dolls and tiny silver furniture for them. The wedding contract said the marriage couldn't be completed until her 12th birthday. Even by medieval standards, this was seen as extreme. Here's what most people don't realize: these weren't love matches gone wrong. They were calculated business deals. Medieval parents weren't monsters, they were working in a system where children, especially daughters, were moneymakers. A daughter with land and titles was basically a winning lottery ticket that needed to be cashed in before something went wrong. And things went wrong constantly. Wars, plagues, political chaos, they could wipe out a family's fortune overnight. So parents played the marriage market like day traders, marrying off children as young as possible to lock in alliances and secure wealth transfers. The truly disturbing part: this was completely legal and socially acceptable among the upper classes. The church had rules about consummation ages, but they rarely enforced them when political marriages were involved. Money talked louder than morality. But here's the historical reality check: while these extreme cases make for shocking stories, most medieval people actually married much later. Peasants and middle-class families typically wed in their late teens or early 20s. These child marriages were primarily a rich people's problem, a consequence of having too much wealth and power to gamble with. Still, for the Margarets and Isabellas of the world, childhood ended the moment someone decided their inheritance was worth more than their innocence. And the real nightmare: this was just the beginning of their marital ordeal. Now let's talk about what happened after you said, "I do," because medieval wedding nights came with a side of public humiliation that would make reality TV producers blush. Welcome to the bedding ceremony, a tradition so intrusive it makes modern wedding photography look respectful. Here's how it worked: after the wedding feast, your friends, family, and basically anyone who felt like watching would escort you to your bedroom. Not to drop you off, to actively participate in getting you ready for your wedding night. The women would take the bride to the bed chamber, strip her down, comb her hair, and put her into bed while offering helpful advice about what was about to happen. Meanwhile, the men would do the same with the groom. Then they'd bring him in, make sure he got into bed with his new wife, and the real fun would begin. A priest would bless the marriage bed for fertility. Then came the stocking throwing. Bridesmaids and groomsmen would sit on either side of the bed and throw the couple's stockings at them. A direct hit supposedly meant the thrower would be the next to marry. Think of it as medieval target practice with your underwear. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable: in many cases, especially among royalty and high nobility, witnesses would actually stick around to ensure the marriage was consummated. They wouldn't watch the act itself. Even medieval people had some boundaries, but they'd wait outside the bed curtains and expect evidence. Take the case of Margaret of York's wedding to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1469. This was such a significant political union that the bedding ceremony became an elaborate affair with numerous noble guests chronicling every detail. The pressure was enormous because if the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled, and all those political alliances would crumble. Now, before you think this was just a rich people's weirdness, understand the logic behind it. In a world where marriage was primarily a legal and economic contract, consummation was what made it official and binding. No consummation meant no valid marriage, which meant no inheritance rights, no political alliances, and no legitimate children. But here's the historical reality check: while bedding ceremonies were real, they weren't as universally practiced as popular culture suggests. This was primarily an upper-class tradition, and even then, the most extreme versions were reserved for the highest-stakes political marriages. Most common folk had much simpler, more private affairs. The ceremony also varied dramatically by region and time period. In some places, it was more symbolic. Guests would escort the couple to the bedroom and leave them with blessings. In others, particularly in Scandinavian countries, public bedding was actually required by law to validate the marriage. Even royalty eventually got tired of this invasion of privacy. King Charles I of England famously barred the door to his bedroom and refused to participate in the tradition. But the custom lingered for another century among various social classes. The most disturbing part. For child brides like Isabella of Valois, the bedding ceremony served as a constant reminder that their childhood was officially over. Even if actual consummation was delayed, Isabella went through this ritual at age 6, dolls and all, knowing that she was now someone's property. You don't learn this in history classes, but these ceremonies weren't just about tradition. They were about control, ownership, and public verification of what should have been the most private moment in a couple's life. If you thought the wedding night was traumatic, wait until you hear about what came next. In medieval times, getting pregnant wasn't a blessing. It was essentially playing Russian roulette with your life every single time. Let's return to Margaret Beaufort, because her story perfectly illustrates the nightmare of medieval childbirth. Remember, she was only 12 when Edmund Tudor got her pregnant. When Edmund died of plague while she was 7 months along, Margaret had to make a dangerous winter journey to Pembroke Castle while heavily pregnant. For a 13-year-old girl, this was almost unthinkable. On January 28, 1457, Margaret went into labor. According to her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, who documented the event, it was a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. That's medieval speak for, her body was so underdeveloped that everyone expected both mother and child to die. The birth was so traumatic that despite Margaret marrying 2 more times after Edmund's death, she never had another child. The damage to her 13-year-old body was permanent. One horrific childbirth had left the future mother of the Tudor dynasty sterile for life. But Margaret's experience wasn't unusual, it was just better documented because of her status. Medieval statistics are terrifying: roughly 1 in 3 women died during childbirth or from complications shortly after. Think about that. Every time a medieval woman got pregnant, she had worse odds of survival than a modern-day base jumper. The medical care available made things even worse. Medieval birthing practices included bloodletting during labor, because obviously what a woman losing blood during childbirth needs is to lose more blood. They used birthing chairs that were essentially medieval torture devices designed to speed up delivery, often causing more harm than help. Wealthy women weren't necessarily better off. Take Isabella of Aragon, who died giving birth at 18 after days of agonizing labor. Even with the best medical care available at the time, which included prayers and herbal remedies, she suffered through multiple days before finally succumbing. Here's what really drove the horror home: noble women were expected to get pregnant immediately and continuously until menopause or death, whichever came first. Eleanor of Aquitaine, considered one of the most powerful women of her era, survived 10 pregnancies, each one a potential death sentence. Most noble women faced 8 to 15 pregnancies in their lifetime. It was baby after baby after baby until their bodies simply couldn't take any more. The pressure was enormous because producing heirs was literally their job. A medieval wife who couldn't produce children, especially male heirs, was considered a failure. Never mind that we now know male fertility issues cause about half of all conception problems. Medieval medicine blamed the woman for everything. And if you somehow survived multiple childbirths, congratulations, you were probably so physically damaged that the rest of your life would be spent dealing with the consequences. Prolapsed organs, torn muscles, chronic pain, these were just accepted as the price of being a wife. The truly heartbreaking part is that many of these women were still teenagers when they started this cycle. Margaret Beaufort was 13. Isabella of Aragon was a mature 18. Their bodies hadn't even finished developing, yet they were expected to immediately start the process that would likely kill them. Medieval marriage wasn't just about finding a partner, it was about finding someone willing to risk death repeatedly to continue your family line. And for women, saying "I do" was essentially agreeing to a lifetime of medical Russian roulette where the house always had the advantage. So you've survived your child marriage, endured a public betting ceremony, and somehow made it through childbirth alive. Congratulations. Now comes the really fun part. Living with a spouse who has the legal right to beat, imprison, or even kill you, all perfectly within the law. Medieval marriage laws weren't just unfair to women, they were downright terrifying. Under the legal doctrine of reasonable chastisement, husbands could physically discipline their wives for any behavior they deemed inappropriate. And reasonable was defined very loosely. There are documented cases of husbands being legally cleared for beating their wives with sticks, as long as the stick was no thicker than their thumb. But let's talk about the ultimate example of legal spousal murder, Henry VIII. Now, Henry lived at the very end of the medieval period and into the Renaissance, but he used medieval marriage laws to their most extreme conclusion. When his wives couldn't give him what he wanted, male heirs, he didn't just divorce them. He had them executed. Take Anne Boleyn. When she failed to produce a male heir and Henry grew tired of her, he had her tried for adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence? Practically non-existent. But it didn't matter. Under medieval law, a wife's adultery was considered treason against the crown because it threatened the royal succession. The penalty for treason was death. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on May 19, 1536, after a trial that was essentially a legal lynching. Her supposed crimes included adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, charges so ridiculous that even Henry's own counsel had trouble making them stick. But they didn't need real evidence. They just needed enough legal justification to eliminate an inconvenient wife. Catherine Howard got the same treatment. When Henry discovered her past relationships and possible adultery, he didn't hesitate to send her to the block as well. She was probably around 19 when she was executed, barely older than a teenager. But here's the really terrifying part, this wasn't just Henry being exceptionally cruel. This was medieval marriage law working exactly as designed. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was tortured and imprisoned for years by her husband's political enemies with her husband's full cooperation. Her crime? Being politically inconvenient. Divorce was essentially impossible. The Catholic Church controlled marriage, and they only granted annulments under very specific circumstances. You had to prove the marriage was never valid in the first place, which usually meant proving it was never consummated. This required humiliating public examinations where women had to undergo physical inspections to prove they were still virgins. Even if you could prove non-consummation, the process could take years and cost a fortune. Most people simply couldn't afford it. So women were trapped in marriages with men who could legally beat them, rape them, and control every aspect of their lives. The law was crystal clear, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even testify in court without his permission. If he decided to lock her away in a tower for the rest of her life, that was his legal right as her husband. And if your husband decided he wanted you dead, well, there were always creative legal interpretations available. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or treason could be fabricated easily enough. Medieval courts weren't exactly concerned with due process when it came to inconvenient wives. The most chilling part is that many of these women knew exactly what they were walking into. They understood that marriage meant giving up all legal rights and placing their lives entirely in their husband's hands. But they had no choice, unmarried women had even fewer options for survival. So when Henry VIII had 2 wives beheaded, he wasn't breaking medieval law, he was using it. The system was designed to give husbands absolute power over their wives, including the power of life and death. And if you couldn't give your husband what he wanted, you'd better hope he was more merciful than the law required him to be. Let's be brutally honest about what medieval marriage really was: a business transaction where the merchandise happened to be human. If you think modern relationships have too much financial pressure, wait until you hear about medieval dowries that could bankrupt entire families. The dowry system was essentially legalized extortion. A bride's family had to pay the groom's family for the privilege of taking her off their hands. And we're not talking about modest gifts here. Some dowries were equivalent to $500,000 in today's money, sometimes more. Take Isabella d'Este, one of the most influential women of the late medieval period. Her family spent 3 years negotiating her marriage like a corporate merger. The dowry negotiations alone involved multiple rounds of bidding, with different families offering increasingly outrageous sums to secure the alliance. Her dowry included cash, jewelry, land, and political promises that would take decades to fulfill. But here's where it gets really twisted: the bride's family wasn't just paying to get rid of their daughter. They were essentially purchasing a son-in-law's protection and status for their family line. If you couldn't afford a decent dowry, your daughter would either remain unmarried, which meant poverty and social death, or marry so far beneath her station that she'd drag the entire family down with her. The groom's family, meanwhile, was making a calculated investment. They weren't just getting a wife, they were getting her dowry, her family's political connections, and any future inheritance she might receive. Marriage was literally a business deal where the bride was both the product being sold and the payment being made. And if you think this sounds bad for the bride's family, wait until you hear what happened to the bride herself. Once she was married, everything she owned, including the dowry her family had bankrupted themselves to provide, legally belonged to her husband. She went from being her father's property to being her husband's property, and she brought her own purchase price with her. But the financial nightmare didn't end with the dowry. Medieval inheritance laws were designed to keep wealth concentrated in male hands. When a woman's husband died, she often lost everything. Widows frequently found themselves destitute because their husband's property went to his male relatives, not to her. This created a vicious cycle where desperate widows would remarry quickly, not for love, but for survival. Some women married 4 or 5 times, each time hoping the next husband wouldn't die and leave them penniless. Others were forced to enter convents, not out of religious calling, but because it was the only way to avoid starvation. The most successful medieval women were those who learned to game this rigged system. Margaret Beaufort, despite her traumatic start, eventually became one of the richest women in England by carefully managing her inheritances and choosing her subsequent husbands strategically. But she was the exception, not the rule. For most medieval families, arranging a daughter's marriage meant choosing between financial ruin and social disgrace. Some families literally went into debt for generations to afford a single daughter's dowry. Others had to settle for marriages that offered no social advancement and provided their daughters with no security. The cruelest irony: even after bankrupting themselves to provide a dowry, families had no guarantee their daughter would be treated well once the marriage was complete and the dowry paid. The bride's family had no legal recourse if the husband turned out to be abusive or neglectful. The money was gone, the daughter was legally dead to them, and they were stuck with the debt. This wasn't marriage, it was human trafficking with a religious ceremony attached. Medieval couples weren't joining their lives together, they were completing a business transaction that treated women as both commodities and currency. And the price of admission to this system was so high that it destroyed families for generations. Love, compatibility, happiness, these were luxuries that most medieval families simply couldn't afford. When your daughter's marriage could either ELE. Here's the ultimate medieval marriage plot twist: all that trauma, financial ruin, and legal oppression we've been talking about. You probably wouldn't have to endure it for very long, because medieval marriages came with a built-in expiration date: death. The average medieval marriage lasted about 15 to 20 years, not because couples grew apart or fell out of love, but because one of them died. Usually the wife, thanks to all that Russian roulette childbirth we discussed earlier. But husbands weren't exactly living to ripe old ages either, what with all the wars, plagues, and complete lack of medical knowledge about basic hygiene. Take the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century and killed roughly 1/3 of the population. Imagine planning your daughter's elaborate dowry and political marriage alliance, only to have plague wipe out half the wedding party before the ceremony. Suddenly, all those careful financial calculations meant nothing because your prospective son-in-law was dead in a ditch. But here's where medieval practicality gets really dark: people adapted to this constant death by treating marriage like a revolving door. Remarriage wasn't just common, it was essential for survival. Widows and widowers would remarry within months, sometimes weeks, of their spouse's death. Not because they were heartless, but because being unmarried in medieval society was essentially a death sentence of its own. Some women became serial wives out of pure necessity. They'd marry, survive a few years if they were lucky, become widowed, then immediately start hunting for the next husband before their resources ran out. It was like a grim game of musical chairs where the music could stop at any moment and leave you without support. The wealthy had it slightly better because they could afford to stay single longer, but even they felt the pressure. Noble families would arrange backup marriages for their children, literally having contingency plans for when the first spouse died. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included clauses about what would happen when, not if, one party died. Here's something that really shows how normalized death was in medieval marriage. Wedding ceremonies included prayers not just for the couple's happiness, but for their souls after death. Medieval priests would literally bless marriages while simultaneously preparing everyone for the inevitable funeral that was probably coming sooner rather than later. The constant threat of death also created some truly bizarre inheritance situations. Some women outlived 3 or 4 husbands and accumulated wealth from each one, becoming incredibly powerful in the process. Others weren't so lucky, they'd lose everything each time they were widowed and had to start over with nothing. Children from these serial marriages created incredibly complex family trees. You might have half-siblings from your mother's previous marriages, step-siblings from your father's previous marriages, and no guarantee that any of these relationships would last more than a few years before another death reshuffled the deck. Medieval record keepers became experts at tracking these constantly changing family structures. Church records from the period read like a soap opera script. John married Mary, who died in childbirth. John then married Susan, who died of plague. John then married Margaret, who outlived him and married Thomas. The psychological impact was enormous. Medieval people couldn't afford to get too attached to their spouses because the chances of losing them were so high. Marriage was about survival and alliance building, not emotional connection, partly because emotional connection was just too risky when death was always lurking around the corner. And yet, despite all this death and trauma, people kept getting married. They kept having children, kept arranging dowries, kept going through bedding ceremonies, and facing down all the horrors we've discussed. Because in medieval society, even a dangerous, potentially deadly marriage was still safer than facing the world alone. When medieval couples promised, "Till death do us part," they weren't being romantic, they were being realistic. Death was the only reliable way out of a medieval marriage, and it usually came calling much sooner than anyone hoped. So there you have it, the brutal reality of medieval marriage laid bare. Child brides sold like livestock, wedding nights turned into public spectacles, childbirth that was essentially a death sentence, husbands with legal murder rights, bankruptcy-inducing dowries, and marriages that rarely lasted long enough for the trauma to fully set in. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go appreciate the fact that I can swipe left on someone without my father negotiating a dowry payment. Because sometimes the best way to appreciate what you have is to remember just how much worse things used to be. And if this glimpse into medieval marriage nightmares has left you feeling grateful for modern love, or at least modern choices, maybe share this with someone who needs a reminder that dating in the 21st century isn't actually the worst thing that's ever happened to romance.